I apologize for the profanity used, but I'm trying to remember every detail of these incidents from my life before you read them. I grew up spending a lot of hot summers at my grandmother's home farther west on the island of Cape Breton in the months of June, July, and August. The plains were a vivid green, the forest was thick, and my grandmother's house was a dilapidated two-story that was constructed in the 1950s and didn't appear like it belonged there. Summers spent here as a child were among the best of my life, despite its flaws. For the next several kilometers into town, there were no other kids to play with. So I ran across grassy fields and smelled flowers in my grandmother's garden to pass the time. I can remember the delicious, divine aroma of my Nana's butterscotch muffins calling me in via an open window. I still recall the warm breeze caressing my skin and the sound of cicadas. I still picture my grandmother's face as she watched me from beneath the porch step, grinning broadly and beckoning me inside. At my grandmother's house, there were several rules, such as not playing in the garden or running inside while wearing shoes. I didn't understand some of them, such as locking the doors and windows before going to bed, despite the fact that we lived far from civilization. The worst part of a night without school was turning off the TV at 8 and going to bed at 9. I didn't ask my grandmother about the unwritten rules, but they included things like not sleeping with our arms and legs off the bed. For example, double-checking the doors and windows. For example, failing to fully close the shower curtain, hiding in closets and behind beds, or removing the cord to the attic from the nail it was fastened to. My grandma was a really popular woman, despite some strange things. She had long, silvery hair that seemed to reflect the moonlight, and she was slender. She could have been considered attractive when her hair was down, but she always had it up in a tight bun, which highlighted the frown lines on her face. She was referred to as a silver fox by my grandfather when he was still living, because although she was young, attractive, and irritable, she was the only one who could respond intelligently and cleverly to one of his jokes. She became softer as she grew older, had kids, and was depressed and aloof after my grandfather died. But I never once doubted her love for me. Grandpa rarely came home, but when he did, it was amazing because he spent so much time out west. When he was away in the summer, my grandmother used to say she enjoyed having me around because it made her feel helpful. In retrospect, I suppose my Nana was lonely. I'll attempt to describe the events in chronological order, although I was young and, for good cause, spent a large portion of my youth here in a state of blackout. My grandmother resided beneath the home. I never once saw her go to sleep. Being a big kid who could sleep in a bed by myself, with my blankets securely over me and my fingers and toes safely tucked away from the edge of the bed, I never gave it much attention. However, she would often come to me through the window, standing in her garden bed, and whispering to me from behind the glass. With her hands clasped around her face to improve her vision, my grandmother's face was pressed against the glass pane. I never did. I had a goofy grandmother when I was a child. Nothing else was involved. Could you please open the door for me, sweetie? I feel a little cold here. From behind the glass, she spoke to me once, her lips moving just enough to make the words audible. I could see that she had nothing on, but the window was high enough for me to view just above her collarbone. "Hey, Jiro, that's silly, Grandma," it was my response after I let out a juvenile laugh. "To enter, you need a key. Before you become cold, come in." After this, my grandmother wouldn't say anything, but her smile would never falter for a single moment. One of the things my grandmother forbade me from doing was to stand in what would have been my Nana's garden. She wouldn't speak to me directly, but I could hear her whispering to me each time I looked away from the window. I thought it might have been nonsense because I couldn't make it out. I didn't look in her direction. For some reason, I didn't want to face her, so I would lie in bed and listen to her say something unintelligible until I fell asleep. She would murmur sweetly to me until I fell asleep, and by morning she would be in the kitchen preparing breakfast and acting as if nothing had occurred. It had become a pattern. When I tried to confront my grandmother about it, she would call me foolish and tell me that I had a vivid imagination, as adults would say to children. After this, I didn't really talk to her about anything. We played a game with each other. My grandmother would come to the window every couple of evenings and ask me to let her in. She would occasionally tell me that I was a good child, and other times that I was a bad one. I only ever saw her smile fade from her face once. Ever since she initiated this game between us, she had been bothering me every night. I would beg her to simply leave me alone so I could sleep, telling her that I was too exhausted to play and that I no longer wanted to. She didn't leave me alone for a few days, but not long, until I became so angry that I screamed at her. As I previously stated, I no longer wish to play. Simply enter your own body and fall asleep. Her scowl replaced her grin, and I felt uneasy with the expression in her eyes. Even though she didn't whisper to me that evening, I would occasionally turn around to see her glaring and frowning at me. I'm not sure how I fell asleep, but I do recall waking up to my grandmother humming a song and the smell of bacon on the cooking pan. I made the deliberate decision to unlock the door one evening. In order to sneak across the chilly floor, undo the front door's latches, and dash to my room to wait beneath the covers for my grandma to finally give up the game, I waited until my Nana went to bed. That night, she didn't visit the window. She entered my bedroom through the door. I heard her drop to her knees. She shuffled on the floor, and I could hear it. That night, with my ear against the bed and the covers drawn over my head, I heard her whispering from beneath my mattress. I could also hear her crawling beneath my bed. I can smell you, and I am so hungry. I moved on the bed so that my back was to the window and the wall. This game was no longer something I wanted to play. Your fucking liver is odorous. I would prefer to never feel the powerlessness of knowing that there was no one I could call to wake me up from this nightmare. You little shitbag, I'm going to crawl inside of you. What she kept whispering to me from under my mattress, I can't tell you. Before going to bed, I checked sure nothing was protruding, cuddled up in my blankets, and mostly filtered it out. I can tell you that my grandmother's eyes were observing me from the bottom of my bed when I opened my eyes just enough to peek out from my blankets. I'm not sure how long I lay there, terrified, but I did fall asleep, and the following day I woke up without my Nana observing me from beneath the bed. She remained silent if she saw the door was unlatched. As she placed the eggs on my dish, she gave me a questioning side eye. I can see that when I wanted to go home, I slightly hurt her feelings. After that night, I made sure the door was closed twice every night until I left for home. She kept coming to see me until I left. I was afraid she could have been watching me back, so I avoided looking at the house that was getting smaller in the rearview glass. I didn't spend the summer at that house again. My grandmother visited me at my house quite a few times, but as far as I can recollect, nothing unusual happened. After the nightly visits ended, my grandfather was diagnosed with late-stage Alzheimer's a few years later. Without being too ostentatious, my grandparents were among the most devoted individuals you could ever meet. The evidence was my grandmother's smile when he asked her for coffee, and my grandfather's sly kisses behind the backs of the grandchildren. When she talked about how he couldn't recall his children's names or her name again that day, I could see the anguish on her face. My grandpa sank, slipped, and eventually slipped away as I watched my grandma endure his illness. After being rude to nurses and hooked up to hospital tubes, my grandmother passed away some time later. Fortunately, She was taken from us by Alzheimer's, so she never had to witness the decline of her mind. My grandmother was vivacious, attractive, astute, and a little strange. I didn't question my mother about it until we returned to clean her belongings from her home. She shared many things with me that I would not have heard as a child. According to her, my grandfather served in the military and wed a much younger woman who worked in a flower store. They spent the majority of their life in poverty, and when he was unable to buy her an engagement ring, he used his own hands to build her a house. In the midst of all, I questioned her about my early years. I didn't talk about what I went through. I had the impression that she, too, would have waved at me casually and told me about my childhood imagination. Your grandmother had a slight superstitious streak. We briefly believed that she might be developing Alzheimer's herself. With a sigh, my mother placed pictures inside a cardboard box. There were only minor details. For example, she forgot to do chores in her garden and couldn't recall where she put her keys. Little stuff only. I had this sudden sensation that a burden had been removed from my chest. That might have been the reason for the strangeness and peculiarities. I thought it was a little impolite to say it aloud. In order to begin removing her belongings from the house and letting it become an abandoned hut in the middle of nowhere, my mother asked me to assist her in packing boxes into the back of her car. After we were done packing, I got into the passenger seat, lit up a cigarette, and turned around to say goodbye for the last time to the location where I spent so much time with my favorite grandmother in the world. The many paranormal experiences I had in my childhood home are not widely believed, but they have influenced who I am now. Before I get into my experiences, you should be aware of some background information. In a big 2-story home in Manassas, Virginia, I shared a home with my mother, grandmother, and grandfather. The Bull Run battlefield was just a short distance away from where we were. I could literally leave my front porch and be in the trails in 10 steps. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Battle of First Manassas, was essentially fought in the woods in my backyard. About a half-mile from our house was the Stonewall Jackson Memorial and the ancient stone school building, called the Old Stone House, if you want to research it, that was converted into a wartime hospital for wounded soldiers. I used to go metal detecting with my grandfather when I was little. Over the years, we discovered a lot of spent musket bullets, buttons from Union and Confederate uniforms, a ton of Native American arrowheads, and antique pottery in our garden alone. Let's move on to some of the spooky things that my family, I, and a few of our visitors have seen, heard, or felt. Up to the age of 13, I slept in my mother's bed as a youngster. The only reason I stopped was when we moved out of that house. This narrative is a little unsettling, but to be honest, it nearly makes me think of a guardian angel or something similar. My mother loves to tell me about this episode, even though I don't remember it. Apparently, I didn't break into my mother's room the previous evening when I was around 4 years old. She expressed her pride in me for sleeping in my own bed like a grown girl that morning. My reply was the nice man came and tucked me in and told me not to be afraid because he was watching over me. She was a little alarmed, but it didn't seem sinister like some of the other things that had happened in our house, and she didn't ask me a lot of questions. Around the home and barn, I used to hear my name called as well. It sounded almost like a distant phone call. When I asked my grandmother if she had been calling for me, she said that she hadn't. She also told me that she occasionally heard her name mentioned. All of us have heard ourselves named over the years, but we have just attempted to ignore it. My grandparents lived upstairs and my mom and I shared the downstairs. My mother and I would be left in charge of the house while they traveled frequently for stamp shows. Strange things would almost always start to happen while they were gone for a few nights. Upstairs, we would hear the radio and television switch on, but when we went to see what was going on, nothing was there. In addition, we would hear the toilets flushing and a ton of footfall throughout the upstairs. Our dog would constantly snarl at the ceiling while lying over our legs at night. She was a very nice dog who rarely used her growl, so it was really unsettling. When my mom and her 3 siblings were children or teenagers, they lived in the house and experienced a lot of spooky things. A man was standing at the foot of my uncle's bed when he woke up from his sleep below. The man, he had to go up the stairs and into his parents' bedroom. He shared his observations with my grandfather. Grandpa went downstairs after grabbing an aluminum baseball bat. My grandfather thought he was having an episode because the previous owners had a psychotic kid, and he returned to the house in a dazed state. They examined every room once they were downstairs, but to no effect. Then he asked my uncle to describe the man's appearance. He described a young man without hands or feet who wore a gray outfit. He looked a lot like a soldier from the Confederacy. He had previously been spotted in the house. In the past, my grandfather was a skeptic who only accepted explanations based on facts and science. One night, he was reading the paper in bed when he looked up to discover the man mentioned before at the foot of the bed. After standing there for a while, he gradually disappeared. Obviously, this caused my grandfather to reconsider some of his previous beliefs. Many years later, as he passed the upper guest bedroom that had been opened, he also saw him. The soldier simply vanished while hovering over the bed. My grandfather is now a devout follower of the spirit world. My aunt told me this tale, and every time I think about it or repeat it again, it makes me cry. When she was a young adolescent, she enjoyed riding her horse at night in the nearby national park. When he started to panic, she was riding her horse in wide circles in an open area encircled by trees. She initially believed that perhaps he had sighted a cougar or bobcat, but she soon threw that assumption out of her head when a feeling of dread overcame her. That's when she noticed it. Between her and the trail home, there was a massive black figure in the tree branches. According to her, it resembled a gigantic man, but was entirely covered in blackness, and she could feel the glare penetrating her. He was purely malevolent. She rode as fast as she could past it, deciding to nope the fuck out of there. It was waiting for her in the property's fruit trees when she got to her front yard. My aunt sent her horse out to pasture, bridle and all, after he had raced to the stable. Even though she never saw the apparition again, the thought of it still makes her tremble. My uncle was a bit of a rascal as a child and would often sneak people in via his bedroom window. He overheard 2 men talking outside his bedroom one evening. I should also mention that the ground outside the window was covered in gravel, and his room was on the lower story of the home. He hears someone dropping keys and footprints on the gravel while he listens to these men. He made the decision to open the window and order his pals who might be outside to come inside and be quiet. There was nobody there when he looked out. He told them to basically fuck off or show themselves, since he believed they were playing a practical joke on him. He assumed it was one of his friends, being a jerk since he didn't hear back. When he finally fell back to sleep, he heard the talk resume. He became frightened at this point. He grabbed a rifle and stepped outdoors, but there was nothing there. I suppose he assumed it was over and that life had moved on, but over time, I believe that this same thing would happen every year in the fall. The sound of the keys falling, the gravelly footsteps, and the discussion. Apparently, he simply adapted to it somehow. My uncle had already moved out when I was born, and lo and behold, it became my room. Although I never heard the keys, I did hear footsteps in the gravel several times. And my mother and I overheard a conversation on the porch downstairs. This time it was a man and a woman. We assumed it was my grandparents taking in the pleasant evening outside. When we questioned them about it that morning, they insisted that they were in bed asleep. When we believed we had herded them, we were terrified. In hindsight, it ought to have been clear from the beginning that something was happening. Even though it was my first time renting an apartment, I felt that the owner wanted me to get settled as quickly as possible. The flat itself was immaculate. The rent was absurdly cheap for the neighborhood, and the entire process, from seeing the place to moving, took barely a week or so. There is always a catch to something like that. At first, apartment 311 was a nice location to live. Since I lived alone, I was able to turn one of the 2 bedrooms into my own office area. It also had 1 bathroom. It didn't even have the unsettling liminal sensation that some vacant apartments have, because it already had a few paintings. The living room occasionally has a faint odor, which was the only apparent drawback I could detect right away. You would occasionally catch a slight whiff of a musty smell, but it wasn't really obvious. It took me a few weeks of residing in apartment 311 before I realized anything was amiss. Simple things like snacks and minor items going missing, various trinkets being put on the wrong shelves and such, were the beginning. The refrigerator was left open on a couple of occasions. I felt like I was going insane since these things would only occur while I was asleep. Nobody could possibly be breaking into my place to relocate some treasures and take some worthless items. Every time I went to bed, I made sure to bolt the door and lock it, even if I didn't think anyone had the key. When I looked into the possibilities of installing security cameras, I was put off by the cost. Even though the apartment was reasonably priced, I was still unable to install a complete security system because of the rent and utilities. I made an effort to ignore it, thinking that perhaps I was maybe simply sleepwalking or waking up for a midnight snack and forgetting by the next morning. Night terrors and other sleep disruptions had always been a problem for me, and they had only gotten worse now that I was in a strange place. Sleep paralysis is by far the least enjoyable of all the sleep issues I've encountered. It used to occur infrequently, perhaps once every 2 or 3 months, but after moving into the flat, it started to happen practically every week. Now, I typically have slight sleep paralysis. I can't move, my eyes are open, and I'm having trouble breathing. I occasionally feel as though someone is in the room with me, but before to moving, I had never had any kind of hallucinations, whether they be visual or otherwise. During my paralysis, I had only ever felt fear and complete body paralysis. I had never seen a ghost, monster, hag, or any other kind of entity. Around the same time, I became aware of the missing meals and lost items. That changed. I felt as though I had woken up as normal, yet I was immobile. Breathing was difficult, and I had the terrible impression that I wasn't alone. I made an effort to relax and remind myself that I had experienced this before, and everything had worked out okay, but something felt different. At that moment, I became aware of my bedroom door gradually opening, inch by inch. Someone or something was entering my chamber, because I could hear the hinges creaking as they swung inward. He was the first to glance around, his lifeless eyes reflecting the dim moonlight coming through my bedroom window. His skin was dry and pallid, and he was bald. His expression made me want to scream, but I was still a prisoner of my own body. The man's chipped yellow teeth were pressed tightly together, grinding against one another, and he had a forced rictus smile on his face. The rest of the man's body crept into the room, tiptoeing as though he were creeping up behind someone in a cartoon, and I stared in dread. The man was completely malnourished, quite skeletoned, and spotted with pockmarks and sores. He was covered in grime and mud, and was completely nude. All I could do was watch as he approached me more and more slowly until I could feel his hot breath on my face. It had the same musty scent that I occasionally noticed in the living room. I felt hatred coming off of him like fire from a furnace, and I never once saw his face alter. He didn't even blink as he gazed at me. For what seemed like hours, he just stood there and stared at me. He eventually pivoted and cautiously slipped back out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. After a few minutes, the paralysis subsided, and my body began to properly awaken, allowing me to move once more. That day, I had to call in sick to work since I was so shocked by the incident that I could not possibly finish any work. Just making sure I was completely alone in each room took up a solid hour of my time. I looked wherever I thought someone may be hiding, including my office, the closet, and beneath the sinks. When I couldn't find anything, I was able to tell myself that I was safe and that it was all a delusion. For some time after that, things remained largely unchanged. Items continued to disappear occasionally, the living room's musty odor persisted, and I experienced another episode of sleep paralysis almost every week. Naturally, I would now have to see my unpleasant guest again each time I experienced sleep paralysis. I gave him the name Jimmy in an attempt to somewhat calm the horror. Giving a hideous visage a humorous name made me feel less afraid. Once I began to get acclimated to Jimmy, the hallucinations of sleep paralysis weren't that bad. He simply stood and watched. Unlike some people's dreams, he never touched me or perched on my chest. I was fortunate that it was at least a constant form of discomfort, even if it was still really awful. Then I discovered the picture. While cleaning up, I came across a photo of two women cuddling in front of a waterfall, hidden beneath a stack of papers. I thought it must have come from the prior tenant because I didn't recognize one of the women. In order to call the previous tenant, I texted Greg, the landlord, to ask if he still had her number. After he complied, I called her in a matter of minutes. After a few rings, she answered, sounding a little annoyed. "Hello, this is Rebecca. Who is this?" "Hi, my name is Flora. I'm the current tenant of apartment 311. I think that you may have left a photograph behind when you moved. I was wondering if you'd want to pick it up or I could mail it to you or something." The other end of the phone paused for a long moment. "Hello?" I inquired. "You need to get out that apartment. You're not safe." To be honest, my only reaction was to laugh. Is this some kind of joke? In between giggles, I questioned her. She let out a frustrated sigh, which I heard. "I'm serious. It's not a joke. You do realize that things have been going missing." "I took notice of that. How do you know that?" "I experienced that as well. While we were sleeping, my partner and I started noticing objects moving or going missing. Mostly small items such as snacks or souvenirs, nothing significant. Although I have never witnessed it, my girlfriend claims that she once spotted a naked man staring at her as she was getting up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water. He appeared more like a corpse than a human, and he was covered with sores. Naturally, we phoned the police once she woke me up, but they found nothing, I believe. Rebecca took a time to consider what to say. What? What is it?" In a growing panic, I inquired. I started to fear that Jimmy wasn't merely a delusion. "I believe that 311 is haunted. We spoke with a few of the other occupants, and it seems that the previous residents simply vanished. Our best assumption is that he must have passed away, but his spirit was never truly gone. My girlfriend tried a cleaning ceremony or something similar because she's interested in occult things, but it didn't work. As things continued to vanish, we finally made the decision to relocate." I ended the call. Yes, it was impolite, but I was so taken aback that I was at a loss for what to do. I at least started to realize why I had gotten this apartment for such a low price. For a time, I just sat on the couch, occasionally catching a whiff of the musty odor. One of the paintings that was on the wall when I first moved in caught my attention, and I stared at it blankly. It showed a white-dressed woman reading a book while seated beneath a tree. It seemed completely unconnected to what was going on, so I couldn't determine what was focusing my attention on it. I finally got over it and went to my office to conduct some research. After doing a little research, I discovered some details about the previous tenant, the one who vanished, who resided here. It seems that 6 months ago, one of his colleagues filed a missing persons report. When I saw a picture of him, I gasped. His name was Michael Hansen. He was just like Jimmy, except that he wasn't as skinny and dirty. I quickly packed some of my belongings and arranged to spend a few nights at a friend's place, explaining that the landlord needed to fumigate my flat due to a bug infestation. I managed to secure a few days off work by calling in and telling them a heartbreaking story about an uncle who was dying. Now that Michael Hansen's ghost was not bothering me, I was able to sleep comfortably on my friend's couch without experiencing any sleep paralysis. We spent the next 2 days doing research. I read dozens of books on occultism and folklore from the local library, researched paranormal websites, and even watched a few of episodes of a corny television program about ghost hunting. Finding a means to bury Michael Hansen's spirit was something I was determined to do. There were innumerable possible answers to my predicament in each of the stories, which varied greatly. While some publications said that iron was an effective ghost repellent and salt was a certain method of driving off spirits, the majority just advised me to give up and relocate. But I was intrigued by one myth. Some people think that the ghosts of the unquiet dead can be bound to the location where an object from their lives was kept. Their spirit would be released and they might enter the afterlife if the thing that their soul was attached to was destroyed. The paintings came back to me. It was possible that Michael had left them behind, but I had believed that the landlord had abandoned them. And I had accidentally been the only one to catch the bloodbath. I yanked it off the wall and flinched as the musty odor grew stronger. I stared in bewilderment as I noticed a tiny rectangular hole where the painting had been, measuring 2 feet by 2 feet in length and width and about 4 feet off the ground. Recalling that Michael's body was never located, I trembled in terror. Maybe he was killed and his body was concealed in the walls by an unidentified attacker. I yelled as I anxiously turned on my flashlight and looked inside the hole. I sobbed in fear as I hurried out of apartment 311 as quickly as I could and then called the police. I had expected to discover a body, perhaps dismembered and covered with duct tape. I was prepared for rot, death, and decay. Ghosts are fascinating, and the idea that a person's spirit may continue to exist after death has a romantic quality.